Over 18 episodes, we've discovered that Steven Soderbergh is nothing if not a man committed to the craft of filmmaking. He's prolific, tireless, and brings a consistent workmanlike approach to each and every one of his projects. It's how he's able to make movies so quickly. But in marveling over Soderbergh's working class ethic, we've sometimes lost sight of the other persona he takes when stepping behind the camera. Soderbergh, the artist.
One of the most fascinating things about Soderbergh is his chameleon-like ability to adapt his talents to so many diverse projects. It's a gift few other directors share. And sometimes it's hard to tell whether he's making artistic choices or simply shooting the way he's most comfortable, which is lean and mean with as small a crew as possible.
Let's put it this way. Hemingway once described stories as glaciers, 10% above the surface, 90% below. Soderbergh's practical instincts have always been above the surface, while his artistic concerns seem to be unseen, but not insignificant, the rock beneath the surface. But that's about to change. In Che, Soderbergh's 2008 epic, he allows his artistic self to take the wheel, and the results are glorious. Welcome to the Filmographer's Podcast, where we study a director's entire career, one film at a time. I'm Michael Moreci.
And I'm Keir Graff. In our first season, we're turning the spotlight on Steven Soderbergh, one of Hollywood's most fascinating and versatile directors. We discuss why each of his films succeeded or failed, always looking at them in the context of the Hollywood landscape at the time they were released.
We hope you've been enjoying our journey through Soderbergh's life and career. If you haven't already done so, please remember to subscribe wherever you get your podcast, follow us on social media, and even support us at Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Filmographer's Podcast, where you'll find exclusives that you won't find anywhere else. That's www.patreon.com/The Filmographer's Podcast. Or you can always visit our website, filmographerspodcast.com. Now, Keir, would you please kick off this episode with your one-sentence description of the film we'll be discussing today, the aforementioned Che? And by the way, viewers, or listeners rather, in this episode, we're covering Che in its totality. Though it was originally released in one part, running over 4 hours long, it was later cut into two separate films and is more commonly known as being two movies. Part one is The Argentine, and part two is Guerilla.
You're sure I can't use two sentences? I mean, it is two movies.
I do have faith in you, Keir, so no, we have to keep the tradition alive. It could be a really long sentence.
It will be. In a riveting epic in miniature that plays almost like cinema verite, we follow the Argentine Ernesto Che Guevara as he helps Castro topple the US-backed dictator Batista in Cuba before leading a doomed attempt to export revolution to Bolivia, an insurgency that fails both because of US intervention and the ultimate indifference of the Bolivian peasantry.
Here, if our mics weren't screwed to stands, I would suggest that you drop yours because that's masterpiece.
I'm just breathing really hard on it. That took a lot of wind.
You're a rudder, Keir, for God's sakes. Okay, so here, listeners, we're going to do something a little different today. Normally, when we put a film in the context of its release, that context has been centered on Hollywood and the movies coming out at the time, the trends, things like that. This time, we want to look at the political landscape at the time of Che's production and release. To do that, I want to take us back to the time of the movie's production. It's 2006. We're just 6 years removed from 9/11. George W. Bush is president. The U.S. is fighting two wars in the Middle East, both of which are getting less popular by the day. It's a pretty dark and uncertain time for the country. But to understand fully where I'm going with this, I want to go back even further than 2006. I want to take us back all the way to the 1990s, back to the time of grunge, a time when indie cinema, as discussed on this very show, was taking over the movie industry. It's the peak of the greatest generation ever, Generation X.
We've all seen the memes, and we all know they're true. Sorry, boomers, millennials, and zoomers. Facts are facts. The jury's still out on Generation Alpha. We'll give them a chance.
We'll give them a shot, but I think I'm pretty confident in Gen X. So, being a child of the 90s, there's a lot I can say about this decade, but for the sake of remaining focused on Che, I'll keep myself limited to this. The 90s were, once upon a time, a decade of optimism. We were going to dismantle corporate control, pioneer artistic freedom, we were going to rock the vote, and we would do it all wearing flannel and corduroy.
Fuck yeah.
Yeah. We had Bill Clinton, the youngest president ever elected, and he was cool. He played the sax, he smoked weed, and he was going to be with us on the front lines as we changed the world. But those things didn't happen. Kurt Cobain committed suicide. Pearl Jam tried to put the cry of "damn the man" into action by battling Ticketmaster, only to discover that most people didn't want actual change. They just wanted their favorite band to shut up and play music. Indie film went mainstream, and Bill Clinton turned out to be a pretty big fraud. In what feels like record time, the optimism of the 90s soon dissolved into the nihilism of the new century. And the new millennium was happy to oblige, giving us Bush, 9/11, Limp Bizkit, and more.
I'm depressed.
Sorry, this is going to be a serious episode. This is a very...
Wait, now you tell me.
a very special episode.
A very special episode of The Filmographers.
But it was really bleak. I mean, we were there. It was bleak. And you can say by 2006, when Che went to production, people were searching for something, searching for an ideal, a principle to believe in and find some kind of hope in.
And not too long after production wrapped on Che, they would find that new hope in Barack Obama. Yes, we can. Yes, we did. I'll skip over what happened next.
Oh, no. But there was definitely, at this time, there was definitely a desire for an entire generation and more to rediscover that optimism that we felt not that long ago. I mean, 2006 to 1992 is not, in the grand scheme of things, not that huge of a gap of time.
Blink of an eye.
Blink of an eye. And that leads me to something that I want to discuss with you, Keir, because to me, Soderbergh and screenwriters Peter Buckman and Benjamin A. Van der Veen approached Che in a very specific way, making him less of a man and more of an ideal. You don't get much of Che's personal life, although from what I've learned doing research for this episode, Che was the revolutionary and the revolutionary was Che. The Criterion release of the film contains an excellent essay from Amy Taubin, and in it she brings up this exact topic, specifically how Che was made during the disastrous Bush presidency. She quotes Soderbergh, talking about his fascination with this project and with Che himself. His ability to sustain outrage is what is remarkable to me. We all get outraged about stuff, but to sustain it to the point of putting your ass on the line to change what outrages you, to do it consistently year after year, is not normal. Now, Keir, this is what I want to ask you. What did you make of Soderbergh's approach? And do you think, despite Soderbergh's fascination with Che, his handling of him as a myth more than a man is a potentially slight choice? After all, Che is a man who's been reduced to an ideal, or at least a brand, for years, occupying public consciousness as a poster in dorm rooms and, a t-shirt worn by young idealists.
And including Luis Guzman's character, Eduardo Ruel, in The Limey, nearly a decade before Che came out.
That's a brilliant observation, Keir. Bravo. That was awesome.
Always watching, always watching. So, Mike, that's a great question. And it's definitely central to this 4.5-hour cinematic experience. There is danger in this approach. Che, as played by Benicio del Toro, is something of a cipher. For the purposes of this movie, his career as a doctor and his role as a husband and father almost don't exist. He's a single-minded, self-sacrificing, pipe-smoking, and curly-bearded symbol of La Revolucion. He suffers uncomplainingly, even when crippled by asthma attacks. He acts decisively and almost always fairly. He loses his temper one time. It's pretty epic, but one time. The man is treated in this film as a saint. And normally I would hate this kind of two-dimensional treatment. I found it fascinating, both because, like Soderbergh, I stand in awe of someone who can sustain outrage and put that outrage into action on behalf of others, and because I think the true focus wasn't always Che. throughout, I thought again and again, what Soderbergh was really documenting was the rebels' humanity, their concern for each other, their respect for the peasants, even their playfulness with little kids. Each injury, each loss means something in a way it just doesn't in so many movies we've seen that treat this kind of theme of rebellion. Whether it's Star Wars or anything else or something more realistic, people always get swept up in the glamour of the battle sequence at some point. I was thinking about the scene where in the second movie when the rebels are ambushed crossing the river and it's a massacre, and he cuts away because we know what's going to happen. And I was thinking, what would, Oliver Stone, who's somebody who, clearly had some very political convictions and sympathies and would have been attracted, I think, to this kind of material. But how would he have handled it? There would have been slow motion, bullets rippling through the water, writhing bodies, blood spumes in the water, just a very, very different approach. I kept thinking that as dark as these two movies got, I found it consistently touching in that Soderbergh was showing the humanity of the rebels. Like I said, they nurse each other tenderly. There are scenes where a man is dying and Che is rubbing his chest and says, the worst is over. And it doesn't feel like a movie moment. It felt very touching. Look, I know it's not a documentary, and I'm sure that in real life, the rebels were less perfect and more human. Certainly Che was. But, I see Che the movie as a remarkably tender and empathetic portrait of humanity. And it's kind of amazing Soderbergh was able to pull that off while simultaneously portraying Che, the man, more or less as a t-shirt.
One of the things that came out of the research was that he wasn't a particularly warm person. So when people accuse the films of being kind of cold, I always feel like that means we were successful in portraying him the way he was described to me. Somebody who was close to him, who we interviewed, who was close to him during the Cuban Revolution and after, was at his wedding, and spent a lot of time with him. This great phrase that stuck in my mind. He said, "You had to love him for free." And I thought that was a really telling remark. And that sort of came up again and again, that unless he was in doctor mode, he wasn't a particularly warm personality, but he was very, very sort of dispassionate about what needed to be done and how it should be done. So I was trying to get that across. That didn't mean I wanted to make him an asshole. It just meant that he wasn't ingratiated. I had no desire to have the film try and cuddle up to people, because that wasn't the impression I got of him at all.
Let's backtrack a little, because we haven't discussed our general thoughts of the movie. So, Keir, quite simply, did you enjoy Che, and did you prefer one part over another?
Che was another huge surprise to me. I had not seen it before. I mean, it had been on Netflix for seemingly years, and it was in my Netflix queue for seemingly years, and I always intended to watch it. And it's just one of those things that I think happens to a 4.5-hour, 2-part movie, that sometimes you keep thinking you're going to find the right time to watch it and you don't get around to it. And well, apparently we had to start a podcast for me to watch this movie. So I hadn't seen it until last week, but I was blown away. Ocean's 13 aside, Soderbergh is in a rich vein of form with Bubble, The Good German, and now Che. I think these are all unjustly underappreciated movies. And it's really, to me, just making the value of this experiment, being the filmographers, so clear. I mean, we're discovering things that are new to me, that are fascinating, educating. I think that for me, in some ways, part one was clearly more involving. It's got the momentum of the rebellion. It's following a much more known historical story, to me anyway. You've got the march toward Havana. And even though it's done in this loose verite style, and it's a very quiet movie in some ways, it's a lot of little skirmishes and a lot of just smaller interactions. You don't get too many big battle scenes. There are some, particularly as it closes out the movie and then they get to the big cities. It just feels more yeah, I don't know, just it's a more traditional movie, even though it's not really a traditional movie. And it's probably easier to glom onto because of the kind of narrative arc in that movie. I liked part one a ton. And I was really curious what was going to come with part two. And ultimately, I think I was even more fascinated by part two. I do think there was more character, as you said, and I completely agree. This is not a rich, nuanced portrayal of Che. It's nonetheless fascinating, but it's not deep acting. But there is more character. There's a lot of noble suffering in this.
Oh boy.
A lot of suffering. This is where we really start to see the rebels care for each other that I was talking about in my my monologue before the break. And I think that is so necessary as they undergo this long march and suffering. And it's just so tragic. Here we see, ideals meeting indifference. In Cuba, you have this sense of, people are getting on board. We want to topple Batista. It's clearly they're in the right. U.S. is backing, the dictatorship. It's a much more clear dichotomy. Now, Castro's trying to export revolution. It's kind of like the way unions look for a case study and like where can we send our activists and our organizers in to get a union, where, they're scanning the headlines. Oh, this Starbucks, there's a lot of unrest. We're going to send our people there. We're going to try to make it. That's a common organizing technique. It makes sense for revolutionaries. They see these problems with the miners and the class war in Bolivia. They think this place is ripe to explode. So they send Che in undercover. He's got to wear a crazy disguise, which is amazing. I mean, wow. This is a sexy actor who's never looked less sexy.
Right. Yeah, almost comical.
Yeah, but based on real life, you see the photos of that passport. They did a pretty good job.
Yeah, they did. Very good point.
And so here, this is a story of a misjudgment where they're trying to export revolution to a place that is often primed for revolution. In fact, they've had many revolutions, but they don't want it brought in from outside. It's maybe mishandled. They don't quite get the popular uprising that they were counting on. So it just turns into this kind of long, almost like a death march. And yet I couldn't look away. I thought it was so gripping. And, in some ways, he's made movies of big ideas like Solaris, where there are almost too many big ideas and they're wrestling and there's not. It feels like he never really came down to what he's trying to say. Here, it's such a quiet, in some ways, slow, methodical movie that it gives you time to wrestle with these big ideas in real time as you're watching. Bolivia is this place for proxy warfare, not just for the U.S., like trying to stem the flow of communism, but Cuba is staging a proxy war too. And is that the right move? Even though we're very naturally sympathetic to Che and the rebels, both sides make missteps. I mean, I'll certainly go with the U.S. as being more evil here, but just let me make that stance clear. But yeah, so I liked them both immensely. I liked two a little bit more. Then again, I'm a guy who likes Herzog movies.
Okay, well, yeah, I mean, which it probably fits. It definitely fits into that wheelhouse.
Aguirre, Wrath of God,
Yeah, no. I mean, I actually didn't think about that, about him specifically, but yes, there's definitely a connection there. It's something that I want to talk about really quickly that you brought up that just kind of dawned on me, and we don't have to spend too much time on this, but we talked about this a little bit in the Ocean's 13 episode as well, which a movie we pretty much enjoyed, but like, I don't want to say we're going to remove it because we didn't enjoy it. We're going to remove it because it sticks out a little bit with this recent run. But if you take that out and you get Bubble, Good German, Che, and it actually keeps going a little bit, and we'll talk about that next episode. But it's unfortunate, and sorry, spoiling our own episode, but I think most people know Che wasn't a blockbuster.
Oh, great.
Everyone's tuning out now. But none of these movies were really successful. And there's reasons why, which we can get into later. But it's weird because it's almost mirroring, as we talked about way back early in our series, of like Kafka, King of the Hill, The Underneath was next, correct? Kafka, King of the Hill, The Underneath, right?
Yes.
So he had that run there of like unsuccessful movies, but these movies, similarly unsuccessful, are so much better. And they're similarly taking the same sort of risk. They're weird movies. They're like fitting into a box just enough to be like a war biopic movie, to be like The Good German, like this, revisionist studio flick, and Bubble like this weird indie thing. So they fit into the box well enough, same way Kafka was a weird indie thing and King of the Hill was a coming of age, even though it's probably the most straight up of these 6 movies.
Sure.
But these are just so much more accomplished and confident, and really it just shows the growth that despite audiences not showing up, which I think is unfortunate, especially for these 3 movies, these are really, really great movies.
I agree. It's just devastating to me that more people didn't see and appreciate them, because he has matured so much as a filmmaker. He's come such a long way.
When I came back on the project and it was still just Bolivia, I felt that without the context of Cuban Revolution, that you just had no idea why he kept going. Like, it didn't seem to make any sense. There were so many different points at which any normal person would have said, this isn't going to work, we should stop.
And so we started backing up and saying, okay, you need to see Che in the revolution, becoming Che and winning, to understand what an extraordinary thing is, that this is a man who won power, became, the winner, the head of the country, the king of the castle, and gave it up to go do it again.
What did you think of these movies?
I'm with you. I think Che is a tremendous achievement. I adore it. Granted, I'll admit, I don't think Che is Soderbergh's most entertaining movie. I don't think it's supposed to be. It's pretty far from it. But thinking about the entertainment value, or even entertainment factor, I should say, we differ a little bit. That I think part 2 is difficult to watch.
Sure.
And not because it's bad, and I'll get to why in a moment. But what I love about Che on the whole is just how relentlessly artistic it is. We've talked a few times about how much Soderbergh admires Godard, how much he looks to the French master for inspiration. And this is the first time, at least in my opinion, or at least my estimation, that Soderbergh is really letting his Godard flag fly. I mean, it's not a typical biopic. It is in some ways, but in a lot of ways, it's really not. And there are a lot of these. It's funny because it's breaking this mold that's like really prevalent at this time. There's a lot of biopics being made. I mean, Ray and Walk the Line are within a few years of these, and both were very successful, both at box office and award season.
Yeah.
Yeah, those were, and there was a few more, but
good point.
Biopics were in.
But this one doesn't have the obligatory boyhood scene where he sees his destiny calling.
No, it's not like his dad is telling him to do something. He's like, no, Dad, I rebel. And then your audience like, oh, it's going to rebel later in life. And that's because Che isn't about Che as the man. It's not about his romantic relationships, his family. It's not about the family he left behind so he can go and liberate oppressed people. I mean, you get a little bit more of that in the Motorcycle Diaries when it shows like young Che, he's a doctor and stuff like that. So that's more about him as a person. And I loathe to say that word, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But this doesn't get you that. This is about Che as an ideal, as a myth, as a symbol of freedom. I don't know if you noticed, like in part 1, you never really see Che straight on, and he's always separate from the men. Like he's framed in really specific ways, but in part 2, you get really close to him, especially at the end.
Yeah.
The camera just gets closer and closer and closer to him. And it's definitely by design.
Very effective.
Yeah. But to accomplish that's to make him the symbol of freedom, you can't get too close to the subject just in general, because that would make him too human, and making him too human would lessen his power. Soderbergh clearly knows this, and that's why he adopts, like you said, the cinema verite style of shooting, and it works remarkably well. As always, Soderbergh discovers the exact right approach for the exact right project, and it just so happens that inspiration from Godard, his idol, one of his idols, would help him find the perfect way to capture Che's story. Now, like I said, I did enjoy part one more than part two. Both movies move at a pretty languid pace, neither, they don't really have, and I think you and I both enjoy it. They don't really have a traditional arc individually or even together.
No, it's kind of like stuff happens.
Yeah. I mean, but that's a product of, I think, again, Soderbergh is trying to, in the cinema verite fashion, capture Che more than dramatize him.
Yes. Yeah.
But part one did have enough elements of an action adventure movie to keep the narrative going. I think you said that. The pacing was a little bit there. The momentum was there. And just two, I just found painful. It was just hard to see the failure, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But the Bolivians, they didn't want a revolution the same way the Cubans did. They didn't want it, like you said, they especially didn't want it imported, which was a factor. And it was just borderline punishing to watch the story unfold. You're just kind of watching and you're screaming for Che, and he has a family. There's that one moment, where he goes back to Cuba and he visits his wife and sees his kids, and they don't know who he is. He's in costume.
Yeah.
And you want him to go back to that. You're like, this isn't working, man. Like, this is not working. Go home. And he doesn't, as we know. But the juxtaposition of the two parts, though, the way that it's set up is brilliant. They function as a twisted mirror of one another in story, and again, how Soderbergh directs them. Close in part two, and distant, and myth building and creating a figure in part one. But that doesn't make that experience of Guerilla any less grueling. At least it was for me. It was hard to watch. But
I mean, I agree with you completely. I'm sure like almost everybody will find watching part one easier to do and part two harder. I think I probably enjoyed part one more, but I think I connected more to part two because of the suffering and there's just something about watching a great hero. Yeah, Ahab and the White Whale, right? It's like the great hero who keeps making the wrong choice, or they just cannot abandon their quest. And he cannot abandon his quest, even when everybody but him knows it's time to pull up stakes and say, it's not working here. He's so committed to the cause, he can't do it.
No, I agree. And I think that's actually, it's necessary. If you're making the myth, that part of it is necessary. Che clearly believed in freeing man from oppression, regardless of the cost, the conditions, or even if they themselves didn't quite realize they were oppressed. I mean, I think they did, but maybe that there was a path to freedom. There's a scene in Guerilla where, Che is dragging a stubborn horse up a hill, and I think it was even raining. It was just this miserable experience, and it feels like a metaphor for the entire film.
Yeah, that's such a brilliant point. Like it's a scene that kind of almost is underlined because it's so out of character for Che that it didn't occur to me at the time. But when you say that, like, I think, that almost is like a filmmaker's metaphor.
Right. I was waiting for him to
live
go,
horse.
He can go like full Schwarzenegger, like Conan, and punch the horse. But Che wouldn't. He wouldn't. Yeah. But also, Guerilla is essential because most people, myself included, until I saw this movie, which, I saw it many, many, many years ago, most people don't know how Che's life ended. They know the poster and they know the brand and they know the iconography, but they don't know just how far this guy took his beliefs all the way to his death and the conditions of his death. And it's vital to understand that. I don't think you can really grasp his importance without realizing his failure, or more importantly, his temerity in the face of his failure.
There's a great moment right before he dies when he's being interrogated by his captors, and they're basically, I think they say something like, how do you know feeling you failed? And he said, well, maybe our failure will be the thing that inspires people to rise up.
Yeah.
I'm getting it wrong exactly, but that's how fervent his belief was, that or maybe, some people might say it was self-delusion, but I think he believed so strongly that he thought there might even be something instructive in their failure.
Yeah, it's such a powerful moment and so indicative of who he was. I mean, you can make the argument that, like, as I was watching, I was like, man, is this a portrait of a guy who just needs the revolution, needs the fight because that's what he's become? But I don't think that's what it is. I think it's just dedication to the belief, to the ideal, to the cause. And those words in just moments before his death really bring home that was the reason he kept going, not because he needed it, is because he believed it.
Yeah.
But that leads me to actually a question talking about suffering and failure.
This is the suffering and failing episode.
Here we go. Hopefully the episode doesn't suffer and fail, and a lot of people listen to it. But my question is, with Che and The Good German, and even Bubble to a degree, are we in Soderbergh's cynical period? I mean, let's compare the uplifting message of Aaron Brockovich to the disillusionment of Good German, the sliver of hope that's in traffic to the despair that hangs over the second part of Che. So I ask, Keir, is Soderbergh getting dark? And if so, how come?
Maybe he's having a midlife crisis. I mean, after all, he was a wizened age 45 years old when Che came out.
Oh,
I kid.
Wait a minute. How old? Never mind. Go.
But I think you nailed it by framing this discussion in politics more than filmmaking almost. The Bush years made cynics out of a lot of us. My own second novel, My Fellow Americans, was about what happens when a Bush-like president cancels the election and tells people he'll be sticking around for a third term. Given what has happened since and the current state of the country, it's easy to forget just how disillusioned and fearful people were then, because that looks like a picnic, So, maybe like many of us, Soderbergh was afraid Dick Cheney was going to take him hunting and shoot him in the face. Soderbergh doesn't follow trends, but that doesn't mean he's unaffected by the times he lives in.
I try and think about the marketplace, but I also feel you have to take into consideration what the material is, and that in this instance, authenticity trumps everything. That you can't make a movie about Che and then, for instance, go and have people running around talking in English. He was very vocal anti-imperialist, so for him to speak the language of the imperialists seemed kind of stupid. And I think ultimately would have been actually a bad commercial move.
Well, I think you're right to focus on Soderbergh's remarkable artistry in Che. He did once again break new technical ground in Che, too. Like Che, Soderbergh is a revolutionary in his own right.
I mean, he really is. I mean, we've talked a lot about his desire to break away from film, as he did with both Full Frontal and Bubble. And now he's taking it a step further, or more appropriately, he's already taken the step and technology has finally caught up to him.
It's the digital revolution in film. And just as he was with the American indie cinema revolution, Soderbergh is again at the tip of the spear.
Yeah, I mean, he is nothing if not bold. So for Che, Soderbergh used a RED camera, and it was the first feature film to be shot on RED, which is a big deal, seeing that RED is one of the most common digital cameras used in film and TV. I mean, Horizon, the new Kevin Costner movie, Hacks, Sandman, Petite Maman, a movie that I love so much. They've all been shot on RED. Soderbergh used it again just recently for his miniseries Full Circle and his feature film Kimmy. The list is endless. The point, though, is that in 2024, RED is ubiquitous. But in 2007, it is not.
Yeah, when Soderbergh was about to begin shooting Che, the camera wasn't even ready yet. Soderbergh fearlessly started with a prototype, and people on the technical side of the movie, the first camera assistant, the first assistant director, were understandably nervous. No one knew for sure whether it would work, if it would sync to sound, or even if it would shoot 24 frames per second. He's taking it to the jungle. Like, will it melt down in the heat?
That is bananas.
Speaking of jungles, bananas.
Hey, maybe you could film on a banana, Steve. But Soderbergh, I mean, he was taking an untested camera out to the middle of the jungle and just hoping for the best. I mean, this is crazy. He didn't even take a backup camera with him just in case.
I mean, that's almost like a Herzog character.
Here we go again. I mean, it really is. It really is. That's crazy. But yeah, Herzog characters go all in, and so does Soderbergh. He had a $60 million budget, and he had a 4+ hour war biopic movie to make, and he knew he had to cut major corners. $60 million for 2 movies, by the way, is not a lot.
That is not a lot.
No.
Even when you don't have a lot of stars. I mean, it's like location shooting and just a ton of minutes.
Yeah, I mean, that's just covering a lot of ground. So using digital instead of film was one such corner that he can cut to reduce cost. It was cheaper, and more importantly, it's faster. He was able to shoot even more than ever before, if you can believe that.
When it comes to Soderbergh, unlike Roger Ebert, I always suspend my disbelief.
I was absolutely convinced that we had to have these cameras for this film, that this was necessary on a creative level for me to have these cameras, and I was willing to put up with anything in order to get them, and I really didn't care if there were problems, or if the heat was an issue and we had to put ice packs. I just didn't care. I just felt like I have to have these, and to the extent of refusing to accept delivery of a film camera package in Spain. I wouldn't even let the production order them. And so it got pretty tense there for a while, because people were wondering what we were going to shoot on if the Red wasn't ready. But I was, I don't know, I just wouldn't be denied.
Before we get back to that $60 million budget and a pretty wild and interesting story that goes along with it, I want to take a moment to trace the movie's development, because it's one of those projects that, like most movies, was kicking around for years before it got going. There's a long story in this, but the shortest version is this. Laura Bickford, the producer who was once romantically involved with Soderbergh and who helped make Traffic, was trying to make a Che biopic based on John Lee Anderson's biography, Che Guevara, A Revolutionary Life. And this was before her work on Traffic. Benicio del Toro was already attached to star, and the story goes that he got wildly invested in the movie. He did tons of his own research, which in a good way, not the modern parlance of our times, doing your own research.
That phrase used to be okay.
Yeah, it used to be commendable. Now you're crazy. He traveled to Cuba. He spoke to, this is so cool. He spoke to revolutionaries that fought alongside Che in Bolivia, who were remarkably alive. And he even met with Fidel Castro, talking about, what's it called? Method researing.
Yeah. Primary sources. That's the best. It's the gold standard.
Yeah.
Talk to people who were there.
Way to go, Benicio. I mean, that's really cool. I mean, he's a cool guy.
Yeah.
But at that point, the pre-Traffic point, the story stalled out at the script stage. Bickford couldn't get the right writer or even the right director, even though they showed it to 2 very fascinating candidates. Both are great, but they couldn't be more different.
Mike, pray tell, who were these 2 directors?
Ooh, I actually have them right here.
Oh, that's
not actually right here.
We wish our ratings would go through the roof.
Yeah, no shit, man. Especially one of them. And well, you listener, you can discern which one. So the first was Christopher McQuarrie, a guy that I think we both love, who's just coming off of an underrated gem, if you ask me, with Way of the Gun, which he wrote and directed. That came off of Usual Suspects, which he did not direct, but he did write. He would obviously go on to become Tom Cruise's go-to writer-director, and he would write and direct the most recent 3 Mission Impossible movies. So there's him, there's Christopher McQuarrie, and then there is Terrence Malick, who's fresh off of, let me check my notes, 1973's Badland. I kid, Terrence. If you're listening, just joking. He's not listening. But it wasn't that much of a gap. Balak had directed The Thin Red Line in 1998, which is a masterpiece, and he was gearing up for The New World, which eventually came out in 2005.
Another interesting side note, Malick was actually in Bolivia working as a journalist in 1966, writing an article on Che Guevara.
Yeah, I think that's crazy. You would think him directing a movie on Che would be meant to be, and you would be wrong. Because neither Malick nor McQuarrie would end up directing this film. Soderbergh would, of course. I mean, that's why we're here.
Hollywood's so crazy. Just before Traffic began filming, all eyes went to Soderbergh. Bickford was there, Del Toro was there, and so was the man they'd been looking for, although he was there all along, having already been involved as a producer. Sometimes it's the last place you look, right?
Yeah, and even then, the project still didn't kick into gear for another few years. I mean, Soderbergh had to make Full Frontal first.
You read that with an impressive lack of tone. It was
whatever do you mean?
It was a very necessary step in his directorial development, Mike. How is he going to know how to portray one of the heroes of the Cuban Revolution if he doesn't first film David Duchovny's death by autoerotic asphyxia? How?
Touche.
I rest my case.
So, sorry. We love Full Frontal. We love it. Anyway, when the movie Che did get going, it did so in the most unusual way. Now, I mentioned having an interesting story regarding the budget, and I won't hold out any longer, dear listener. So get this. In 2006, the United Nations building was about to be remodeled for the first time ever. Now, for those unfamiliar with Che's history or even the movie, Che famously spoke at the UN in 1964. That speech, where he delivers his famous "Homeland or Death" quote, is central to the part one of Che, the movie. The problem, though, was that if the UN got remodeled, it wouldn't look the way it looked when Che spoke there in 1964. So Bickford, Del Toro, and Soderbergh had to act fast. They jumped into action and filmed the entire black and white New York sequence, including the footage at the UN. And that speech, by the way, that Che delivered in the movie is the exact speech that he gave at the UN. In fact, every moment, according to Soderbergh, every moment, every scene in the 4-hour plus epic is sourced. If a scene couldn't be proven, it didn't go into the script.
Yeah, that just blew my mind. And it's funny, we were talking recently about Ocean's 13, and I didn't think I'd be bringing it up this episode, but he and his writers are very meticulous about making sure the logic tracks in those movies. He's now making a much more important historical film, and he's more meticulous. But again, like, it's just that careful preparation and paying attention to facts, whether it's, a con stringing together, or whether it's, people being able to punch holes because he romanticized some scene that didn't really happen.
Yeah. I mean, if you watch the on the Criterion disc, the bonus features, and it's this episode, and Keir, we've talked about this. This was a tough episode because not only is it a long movies, there's also so much that you can get into with Che, with the making of these movies. We could have spoken more about the red camera, for God's sakes. But like,
and just a plug for the Criterion disc. This is why you get it, folks. I mean, the extras are fantastic. There's just so much good stuff there. There's a half-hour British TV documentary that is harrowing.
Yeah, we were talking about that as well earlier. It's terrific. It's terrific stuff. But one of the making ofs, I forget exactly which one, they talks pretty in detail. The writers actually talk. Actually, I'm sorry, one of the writers is only on it. Or no, I'm sorry, both are on there, I believe. I was watching it late at night. But anyway, they talk about how the movie was crafted and about, the getting the source materials right, how they broken into, how they did everything they did to get the script to where they wanted to go. And it's something, again, that we can talk about at length, but we try to keep these, brief enough, but it's definitely worth checking out. Anyway, Soderbergh and company shot this entire chunk of the movie, this going back to the New York and the UN stuff. They shot this before they had permission from their financiers. Not only did they fail to ask permission to shoot the New York sequence, but they also failed to ask if they could extend the movie to cover 4 hours and chop it into 2 separate films. And oh, by the way, it's going to be in Spanish now, not English.
I mean, I'm in awe. Think about the risks Soderbergh is taking here, like shooting on a prototype camera, shooting without permission, changing the entire scope of the film. Wait a minute. I think he's a freedom fighter, a revolutionary too.
Wow. It's deep. But you know what? A side note, going back to those bonus features, that like Soderbergh made a great point that he's like, if you're going to make a movie about fighting colonialism, speaking in the tongue of the colonialists is probably not a great idea.
Yeah, that's very astute and just very, very admirable.
Yeah, that's definitely the right call.
And also too, I mean, they didn't cast a bunch of, find roles for, I mean, they found a role for Matt Damon, but it was small and it was a German priest. So, okay. But it's cast with native Spanish speakers and people who I don't know what countries they're all from, but like, this is not where a bunch of white, Hollywood movie stars parachute in and then dye their hair brown. I mean, this was the real deal. Yeah,
totally. And I'm not even going to say the actor's name. The man who played Castro, I'm not going to butcher it. That actor, that gentleman, he makes everything he's in better. I love him. I love him. He's so good. I like him in Hateful Eight is just deliriously fantastic. He's hilarious. I love it. But all of this, everything we've talked about, this not asking permission, breaking the movie into 2, making it longer, somehow making it work on a $60 million budget, all this stuff is thoroughly Soderbergh. By the time someone finds his playbook, man, he's already writing a new one and not asking permission to do so.
Hi, this is Keir with a brief interruption to our regular programming. But once again, we're asking for your help.
Keir, not the NPR bit again.
This is not part of our regularly scheduled pledge drive, but listeners, we need your help to make up for a budget shortfall in our current fiscal quarter. Even with our generous grants from the MacArthur Foundation and the estate of Joan B. Kroc, we're having trouble making ends meet. Our Hollywood correspondent has been sleeping in his car.
None of that is real. None of it.
Well, they are part of the filmographer's cinematic universe. They're just not real yet.
We have entered the arena of the unwell.
Listeners, we need your help. Please join our Patreon community at patreon.com/thefilmographerspodcast. Our free tier, the Limey, gives you access not only to all of our regular episodes, but also our monthly newsletter. For only $2 per month, the Magic Mike, you'll get all of our regular episodes ad-free, plus our monthly newsletter, access to listener polls, and other bonus content like essays and extended versions of the show.
The Magic Mike really should be our top tier. I'm just saying.
For $4 per month, the Cisco, you'll get everything we've already mentioned, plus our every other month Patreon exclusive episodes, like our one about the films Soderbergh didn't make and our Singani tasting. Finally, superfans who want to be do-gooders like Aaron Brockovich can support us at our highest level of $6 per month. For that, they get everything I've already mentioned and an every other month commentary track. Again, pardon the interruption. And we now return to our regularly scheduled programming.
I suppose operators are standing by to take your call.
Don't be ridiculous, Mike. This is a podcast, not live radio. Visit patreon.com/thefilmographerspodcast today to show your support. So if memory serves, Che, like Bubble, had both unusual financing and an unusual release plan.
You're right on both counts. First and foremost, the movie was essentially paid for before it even started filming. Foreign pre-sales covered $54 million of the movie's $58 million budget, so the film had a very short way to go toward breaking even. But this is where things get complicated.
Yeah, it's a little confusing because while the movie was sold for a high price tag to foreign markets, it made almost no money in the United States. Parts 1 and 2 combined brought in less than $2 million, And I don't know if the money it made in foreign markets, a little over 40 million between both films, went against pre-sales or those box office draws were considered separate from that.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure either. I guess it doesn't really matter because no matter how you look at it, the movies combined to make barely $42 million and it was hardly even seen in the US. But there's a wrinkle to that. Backtracking a little bit, Che had its premiere at Cannes, where it received a pretty warm response. Reviews were a bit mixed, but they seemed on the positive side, and it wasn't entered for competition, so it wasn't eligible to win any awards. So it didn't win any, but it couldn't win any. After that, it played a few more film fests that eventually at one theater in both New York City and LA, and sold them out completely. It was performing really well. It expanded a little from there, not much, but it never had a proper wide release, like not even close. I mean, we talk about this with Bubble, but this is a whole different animal. This is a big budget biopic with Benicio del Toro in it.
Yeah.
I don't get it. I mean, at its peak, it played at 35 theaters in North America. Again, like Soderbergh said many moons ago when we were talking about, I forget what, maybe it was when we were talking about Schizopolis, but as he said then and has said repeatedly, making movies is one thing, getting your movie seen is another.
And this is where I do a callback to last week's episode with Ocean's 13. As I said, listeners, remember this number when you said how many theaters that Ocean's 13 played in. It played in 3,565 theaters, and Che played in 35.
Is that 1%?
That's 1%. 1% of the theaters.
1%. It's not good. At the start of 2009, IFC, who had purchased the North American distribution rights, released the movie on demand. That's where you get into the, not typical release strategy. So it was available as video on demand. You can rent it. It was available to rent on all major cable providers.
Yeah, and like Bubble, a very different movie. It's just a risky release strategy. And yeah, because they're risking a lot more. With Bubble, you've got non-actors, super low budget. It feels like more like the kind of project to try something like that. It's just a different story. According to Wikipedia, which cites a source from a website called Movie City News, so take this with a large grain of salt, Che returned, quote, good money for IFC, end quote. Though I just don't know how that's really possible. Like we said, it grossed under 2 million, but if it was purchased for low six figures, maybe that ekes out a profit, define good. Yeah, it depends on what they spent on marketing, and then there's whatever they made on VOD. It just seems like domestically, a lot of money was left on the table. They did well to sell the movie overseas, and it seems like they recouped everything they needed there, but I just don't know if they even had a release strategy for the movie in North America. I mean, possibly a byproduct. Oh my gosh, is this because it was in Spanish? Is that... I mean, that is a financially risky decision, unfortunately, and Soderbergh knew he was making that decision. But it just might be the case that IFC and VOD was the release strategy and a wide theatrical run was never in the cards. Either way, can we call it a hit? Not really.
Yeah, I don't think so. I just don't know. There's a lot of things that are very puzzling. They said, did the money it made overseas go against pre-sales? Did it not? Was VOD the strategy? Did it do well on VOD? And I remember actually that's how I saw it.
And I feel like those numbers, who knows, right? That's very opaque stuff.
Right, exactly. I mean, this is all still very, again, like Bubbles, very nation experimentation of like releasing a major movie on VOD and seeing what happens. I can't think of any other movie that did that. I really don't know. But this leads us, going off the commercial reception, leads us to the critical reception, which is also, you could say, good, not great. It's weird because, in all the reviews I've seen, there seems to be a common thread that like critics were blindsided by this movie, which is so weird. They seem to be like, they just didn't see it coming, which I guess makes sense. I don't know. In the good reviews and the bad, they didn't seem to know what to make of the movie, which I don't know. I keep saying I don't know because I'm so puzzled by all this, but Soderbergh for so long had kept his narratives tight and concise for the most part and almost to a fault. And then all of a sudden he goes full Lawrence of Arabia.
One of my all-time favorite movies. If I were a critic and the press materials billed it as Soderbergh's Lawrence of Arabia with Benicio del Toro as his Peter O'Toole, I wouldn't have bothered to watch the movie before I wrote my 4-star review.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I'm puzzled by the puzzledness. Is I guess
It's
why
all
I'm
very
stumbled.
puzzling.
It's all very puzzling. The critical response, the commercial response, like I did a lot of digging and I couldn't. I mean, the critical response is pretty straight up. Again, the commercial response was unclear, the strategy and unclear the performance.
Yeah, I mean, I get why Bubble didn't find its audience.
Yeah.
This one is just much more puzzling to me. Sorry.
And it had a decent festival run. There's just a lot of weird, what I would like to know deeper, and I don't know exactly how you'd find it. I guess you'd have to probably talk to Soderbergh directly, but what was the strategy and what happened, especially in the North American release?
I mean, does this go back to politics? And this is not is this a time when people are worried about illegal immigration and it's not a good time to release a Spanish language movie? I mean, we talked about kind of the political climate when he's making it. Certainly there's some, there's a lot of dissent, but there's a wave of conservatism, at the top of the country. Maybe that all conspires against it.
It could be. Yeah. I mean, and sometimes people in bleak times don't want bleak movies. I mean, not the movie's bleak, but heavy and challenging. And it's also, people may not see it salient to American life, so it makes it a tougher sell.
Yeah.
There could be a lot. But anyway, so let's talk about that critical reception. We mentioned him a lot. Scott Foundas of LA Weekly said, "It's nothing if not the movie of the year." That's good. Brian Tallarico, our man at RogerEbert.com, said it's both a subtle commentary on failed political ideals and an amazingly detailed character piece. Che is like no movie you've seen in a long time. It's one of the best of 2008.
I agree with everything he said, except that it's an amazingly detailed character piece.
Yeah, I don't think that's true. But okay, thanks anyway. Roger Ebert gave it 3.5 stars, praising, as many did, Del Toro's performance. He also appreciated the film's length, noting it was necessary for experiencing how much and for how long Che endured, which I think is a brilliant point.
Excellent point.
Yeah, it reminds me of The Irishman. The whole, people say it's long, and it is, but that's the point, is that this guy has been around for too long.
Some movies need to be long.
Yeah.
Some need to be shorter, like Ocean's 13.
Right. Yes. And this is I feel like Che, despite being...
It earns its length.
Yeah, I agree. And our man, A.O. Scott, writing for the New York Times, also gave the film 3.5 stars, saying, "Once again, Mr. Soderbergh offers a masterclass in filmmaking." Now, that praise aside, the film did have its detractors. Vulture, the Seattle Times, and the San Francisco Chronicle all gave the movie negative reviews. Anthony Lane of The New Yorker called out the movie's flatness, going so far as to wonder why Soderbergh even chose to tackle such a thorny topic as life of Che Guevara. He says, and quote, "It would be comforting and tidy to suggest that the director had waited all his life for the chance to make this film, as if it meant everything to him. Yet I still have no idea what truly quickens his heart. And at some level, for all the movie's narrative momentum, Che retains the air of a study exercise, of an interest brilliantly explored. How else to explain one's total flatness of feeling at the climax of each movie?"
Sometimes reviews say more about the people writing them, I think, than the thing that's being reviewed. I mean, I didn't feel totally flat of feeling at the climax of each movie, and I felt devastated and moved at the end of, particularly of the second one.
Yeah, and I think the end of one is iconic, where I forget his fellow soldier's name, but he's driving the coupe, whatever, convertible, and Che's like, "Go turn around and bring that back to where you found it. And if you have to walk to Havana, you're walking to Havana."
Yeah.
I thought that's like a perfect moment.
Yeah, it shows this man walks the walk.
Yeah. Now, Keir, this all leads me to what I hope is an interesting question. This is, and we've danced around this subject array, that this is the third movie of Soderbergh's last four. Again, we're not including Ocean's 13 in this run, but it's the third of the four that's failed to connect with audiences. I'm wondering, why do you think that is? As we noted earlier, Bubble, The Good German, and now Che are all pretty heavy, even dark movies. Is that the problem? Now, before you answer, let me present you with some of the stats from 2008. A lot of the top movies at the box office that year were, and this comes as no surprise, lighter fare. Iron Man, Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, Kung Fu Panda, Twilight, Juno, the lone small budget breakout hit, and Tropic Thunder were all mega hits that year. But the top grossing movie of 2008, outgrossing its nearest competition, Iron Man, by over $200 million domestically, was The Dark Knight, which, despite centering on a man dressed as a bat, was definitely a heavy film, one that felt like a direct response to the chaotic, fearful national mood post 9/11 in a very real and very direct way. That said, maybe darkness isn't Soderbergh's problem. And if it's not, what is?
Oh, man. I mean, these movies may reflect the darkness of the times, but I think it's almost more that culturally they're just out of step. You know, Soderbergh is making movies like it's still the 1990s. And sure, The Dark Knight is dark, but it's also got a superhero who wears his underwear on the outside of his leotard. And at some point, I just think that puts butts in seats no matter what. And then people can still enjoy the superheroic aspects and then say like, yeah, and it was also really mature and gritty and, you know, reinvented the superhero genre and all that stuff. I mean, I like The Dark Knight. I'm not, as you know, I'm not a superhero movie guy at all, but I liked it. It was good. But to me, there's just no conflating the two. But it is fascinating because anything that touches the superhero genre, you know, like Joker or whatever, can get a much wider audience than these movies. Just because people, you know, even if they're going to hate it or they're just going to hate watch it or whatever, or talk about how it, you know, celebrates incel culture or some damn thing, they're still going to have an opinion on it just so they can say they saw it.
And really quick, they were distributed.
These
movies were not.
Yeah. So yeah, I enough on the superhero stuff, but I think, you know, Bubble, Good German, Che, these are adult movies for adult film goers. It's just always a tough sell. And the way they were marketed and sold, or not distributed or not sold, surely contributes to their lack of success at the time and their lack of a lasting cultural footprint. You know, movies that didn't do well theatrically just didn't have a wide cultural impact. And I would argue they still don't. People are still wrestling with this. You know, can we break a big movie on streaming? And I still don't think you can. It's kind of like, to me, it's like reading on an ebook. Like you can still get the same information, but it just doesn't stick with you in the same way.
That's a great comparison.
You know, and as we've noted before, I think, you know, Bubble and Che played in fewer theaters than there are states. So there are risks to being at the tip of the spear. Sometimes you get poked.
Oh man, yeah. And there's more to Che's legacy than just his box office and critical response. Che really affected Soderbergh, and not in a positive way. In an interview with Henry Barnes of The Guardian in 2009, Soderbergh does not look back on the making of Che or its release with much fondness. Here's a quote from the interview. "Everyone got scarred by Che a little bit. I don't know how to describe it. It took a long time to shake off. It was just an intense 4 or 5 months that it really..." There's a long pause, and this is from the article. He speaks slowly and evenly. Quote, "You know, for a year after we finished shooting, I would still wake up in the morning thinking, thank God I'm not shooting that film." When asked if he wished he hadn't made it, Soderbergh said, "Yeah."
Man, that's just devastating. I'm glad he made it, but, you know, talk about suffering for your art.
Yeah, I mean, there's a good amount of bleakness that Soderbergh is voicing in this interview. He seems exhausted. Che was an arduous shoot. That's probably not a surprise to anybody. He made this 4+ hour war biopic epic in 4 fewer days than he had made Ocean's 11. Yeah, and at this point, he knows it wasn't for much. The movie wasn't a big hit, commercially or critically, and according to Soderbergh, the movie was pirated online to death, which he cites as a significant contributor to the movie's lack of box office success. Not only that, but Soderbergh, for the first time, like I said, is sounding weary. We've seen him hit a low before, right at the time of The Underneath.
After he started shooting The Underneath.
And throughout the whole damn thing. But even then, he said in multiple interviews that he could get his mojo back. You know, he repeated that. Like, he used the analogy of being a baseball player, where he woke up and he didn't have it and he knew it was gone, where when he finished The Underneath, he's like, I know I can get it back. But here, he sounds different. Take this quote. And this is also from the Guardian interview, by the way. I'm looking at the landscape and I'm thinking, I don't know. A few more years maybe, and then the stuff that I'm interested in is only going to be of interest to me. Going even further, he says, quote, in terms of my career, I can see the end of it. I've had that sensation for a few years now, and so I've got a list of stuff that I want to do that I hope I can do, and once that's all finished, I may just disappear, end quote. A few years from now, we'll discover that he wasn't kidding, but that time hasn't come yet.
Never retire, Steven Soderbergh. I hope that list is long and growing.
I hope so too.
Listeners, if you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on your platform of choice and help us spread the news. Tell your film-loving friends about us, share our episodes on social media, and be sure to give us a good rating or review wherever you get your podcasts. Those ratings truly make a big difference.
And if you really want to show your support and help us keep doing more deep dives into directors' filmographies, find us on Patreon at www.patreon.com/thefilmographerspodcast. Every dollar makes it easier for us to produce the show and share our passion for movies and the stories behind them with you. Thank you in advance.
And thanks, as always, to Kevin Lau, our tireless producer, Gompson, who composed and played our theme music, and Cosmo Graff, who designed our logo.
Join us next week on the Filmographers Podcast when we'll discuss Soderbergh's next adventure in low-budget filmmaking, where he'll try to win over audiences by citing Ingmar Bergman as an inspiration.
He never quits. The kids love Bergman about as much as they love Antonioni. But maybe if you put Sasha Grey in front of the camera?
Maybe.